evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind plagued with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems, the ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Now, most podcasts put their promotion and copywriting stuff halfway through or even towards the end. But because I'm hoping you're asleep long before we get there, I need to put this stuff up front. The show is brought to you with the help of the supporters on Patreon. I'm hearing from people all the time how valuable they find the show, and those supporters who have the means to help fund it, to keep it going and help me to reach new audiences, are very much appreciated. So if you're making use of Sleepy Time Tales regularly to help you deal with sleeplessness, and you have the urge to support the show, and most importantly, if you have the means, please check out patreon.com/sleepytimetales or go to patron.sleepytimetales.net, hit one of the links in the show notes, or you can go from the website to take a look at what's on offer. If you sign up, you'll have the satisfaction of knowing that you're contributing to the rest and lifestyle improvement of thousands of people. And over and above that, there are real rewards from as little as $2 a month. So from early release to weekly bonus episodes and special edits of the main show. But if monthly support seems a little bit much to commit to, there are other ways you can support as well. There's the chip jar, the merchandise store, and other things. Again, you can hit them on the website. But arguably, an even bigger way to help support the show is simply to spread the word. If there's someone in your life who you think will benefit from listening to Sleepy Time Tales, just let them know. And if you recommend the show on social media, make sure to tag me in so that I can see and I can thank you. That's at Sleepy Time Tales on both Instagram and Twitter. And I want to break away from my usual script a bit here to emphasize the importance of this particular thing. I was chatting to a listener on Instagram recently, and they said that they wished that they could support on Patreon or give a tip, but simply can't afford it. Now, while we live in a capitalist society and money does help us get by, I can't overemphasize how helpful it is to provide feedback and to spread the word. Which is something that this particular person, feeling guilty about not having money to support me, has done. This is why when I talk about the Patreon, I make sure to say, if you have the means. Times are tough, people are struggling, and need to put their money into so many things. So while I definitely could use the financial support, I don't want anyone who can't do that to feel guilty. Simply listening to the show is enough. And spreading the word or letting me know that you're listening and finding value in what I do is amazing, and I love and appreciate it. So having said that, I'd like to show some love and appreciation for the following people who, in the last couple of weeks, have reached out to me on Instagram or shared their enjoyment of it with their followers. So I'd like to shout out Ms. Tina, Can You Catch a Cloud, Ugly Shelly, sorry, that's her name, not mine, and Michaela, all who've either made a recommendation or sent me a message. So thank you very much for what is also very important support outside of just reaching into your pocket and handing some money out. And I've gone on a bit long, so let me call it there. As always, I need to shout out the music, which is Un Desire by Kumiko. Their music is available on the Free Music Archive, or actually, I recommend going directly to their website. It's loyaltyfreak.com. I've also linked that in the show notes, and it's definitely cool stuff to take a look at. They've got like 2,000 songs available, most of them freely available for use in creative projects. So if you have a podcast or a video or YouTube video series or something you're looking at, take a look. And enough of that, back to the show. So what exactly is Sleepy Time Tales? What is it for? It's a bit of a strange idea after all, a podcast that you're supposed to fall asleep to. But lack of sleep is a health crisis in the 21st century, and this is a podcast of a sort that is intended to help those that it can to get a restful night. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, with your mind spinning in emotions in turmoil with anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off again at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to help you into a restful night. I'm someone who has struggled to sleep ever since I was a baby. My parents had sleepless nights with me for years before I got old enough not to bother them anymore, but it really was always a struggle for me. As I grew up, a lot of people I knew liked sleeping with the TV and the radio on, but I resisted, thinking that silence worked better for me when it came to sleep time. But I discovered when I tried listening to podcasts that droning voices actually did have a tendency to act like a tranquilizer for me. They didn't have the light that would disturb me of the TV or the music or ads of the radio. They were a little bit more monotone and a little bit more consistent the whole way through. And so when I went to bed with podcasts to listen to because I was expecting to lie awake all night, I'd find myself waking up having slept through everything I was trying to listen to. I eventually also discovered that there are podcasts out there specifically designed for that, designed to help you sleep or intended to help you sleep rather, in different sort of formats. I tried a few and a couple worked really well for me, but when I recommended them to others, they sometimes didn't resonate with the people I recommended them to. So I thought, let me take my deep droning voice and see if I can help some of those that can't be reached by those that are other podcasts that are out there already. Now, every episode of Sleepy Time Tales starts with this long intro. It usually goes on for roughly 15 minutes, and it's the thing that if I get a complaint, it's the most complained about thing. But it has two very important purposes. Firstly, I need to explain the concept of the show to new listeners. I need to explain why I think it'll be helpful, which I've already started doing, and how I think it's helpful to engage with. And that's what I'm going to get into quite soon. But now there's a lot of people that have been listening to the show basically since day one, and they don't need me to explain every week to them how to listen to the show. But most of them do still listen to the intro, and there's a reason for it. For them, this intro is generally the same thing, mostly over and over again. I redo it every week. I don't just copy and paste and reuse it because I like to keep it a little bit fresh. But overall, it's a very similar structure because what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to help listeners create a new habit. In a lot of ways, insomnia really just is a bad habit. Well, depends on what's causing it, but largely it's bad sort of sleep hygiene and a tendency to some of us to brood on things we have no control over at night. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to replace these habits with a different one. So for people that have been listening to the show for a while, they pop the earbuds in and maybe they start getting themselves ready for bed, brush their teeth, have a drink of water, get your environment cool, because a slightly cooler environment actually helps you sleep better. Nestle yourselves into your blankets and get ready to go to sleep, because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to build a space together. A little nest or a cocoon that you can curl up in and allow sleep to come for you. Now, as far as I know, there's a couple of different ways to engage with this show. For me, I need something to focus on. I need something like those, usually there were video game podcasts that I used to listen to and fall asleep to. Something that would keep my attention and stop me from resisting sleep when it came for me. I need to focus just enough not to resist sleep when it comes for me, and I think that's probably the majority of the listeners of the show. For some people, there's a second way. It's something a little bit more primal. White noise and the like has become a thing lately. And so some people might need the sound of the ocean or wind in the trees or the sound of rain. Or maybe you just need some boring dude droning on telling you a story that's not particularly interesting. And hey, I'm your man. I've had a request recently to do a little bit more non-fiction because it's generally quite effective stuff to help people sleep. And I thought, yeah, I haven't done anything like that in a while. So tonight I'm doing Women's Work in Music by Arthur Elson. Now, it's definitely a product of its time. It was written in 1903, so there's a lot of sort of fairer sex type stuff in it. But overall, I think it's well-intentioned and also rather interesting. It's a look at women's place in music and the production of music in different societies up until the time it was written, and actually quite interesting in how egalitarian it was often in earlier societies in the involvement of women in music. And that, of course, changed, particularly in the West over time. But whatever the story is, whether it's a romance or a mystery or a slightly dry textbook on the history of music, what is important is that you don't force sleep. Just keep your mind keep a sort of light mental grip on the story as I'm telling it or the content as I'm reading it out to you, and allow the need for sleep to come for you. Now, obviously, I'm hoping that you're asleep before you get to the end of the episode, but it's very important that you don't feel pressurized. If this is your first night, the odds are pretty good this is not going to work for you. It may take a few nights for you to get used to listening to my voice, or maybe my accent is strange. So I suggest giving it a solid 3 nights try. If by the end of the 3rd night I'm not helping, then I probably can't, and I'm not the guy for you. Somebody else maybe will be. It's also possible, especially early on, that one episode just isn't long enough. What I do with my sleep podcasts is I keep a whole bunch downloaded of the different ones that I listen to, and I start on the latest episode and I just let them play all night. I lie down in the dark and with my earbuds and I let them run. Often lately I actually wake up at about 3 a.m. and if it's still running, I'll put my earbuds back in, and if I've fallen out, and let the voices waft me back to sleep. Sometimes I even wake up like 30 minutes before my alarm goes. Usually I do the same thing. I carry on listening to my podcasts and I fall back asleep again. And you may want to say to me, Dave, why would you go to sleep for half an hour? How does that help you in any way? And I've got to tell you, it really does. There's something about allowing yourself to relax completely right before your alarm that is just deeply, deeply satisfying. But it's very important that what you do above all is try to relax. If you're new to the show and prone to late nights lying staring at the ceiling, this will probably seem strange for you. So, as I say, just give it a chance. And that's the idea. You relax and you lie in the dark, and while you do that, I'll tell you a tale. So relax, dear listener, my nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark, listening to my voice. You will always be safe with me. I'm here to help you relax, to improve your life in a small way. People don't sleep very well these days, and it makes their lives harder. So I'm here to do my small part to help you in a big way. To help you to face tomorrow and the day after, well rested and better able to cope and process. I believe very strongly in kindness. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. But most importantly, I need you and you need you to be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up or rebuke yourself over not sleeping. Don't get tense if you just can't get yourself over the edge of sleep, even with me here in your ears trying to help. Frustration is one of the greatest enemies of a good night's sleep, and the intention with this podcast is to short-circuit that frustration, to distract the feeling we get when we blame ourselves for not being able to let go and drift into the dark. So take a breath. Forgive the fact you can't sleep and let my voice wash over you. Take another breath. Imagine the warm darkness rising up, inviting you to sleep into a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself and we can try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, sleep is something like an enemy. But it is not your enemy. It's a natural process that we've been pulled away from by stress and life, and supposed progress shining bright lights in our eyes at all hours. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still with me, thank you for staying. If you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course, you aren't hearing me, except maybe in a dream. Women's Work in Music, being an account of her influence on the art in ancient as well as modern times, a summary of her musical compositions in the different countries of the civilized world, and an estimate of their rank in comparison with those of men, by Arthur Elson. Copyright 1903 by L.C. Page and Company. To Mrs. Louise C. Elson, true type of self-sacrificing wife and mother in a musical family, this book is affectionately dedicated by her son. Acknowledgements are due to Mr. Otto Fleischner of the Boston Public Library for his kindness in furnishing lists of periodical articles being on the subject of this book. The author. Chapter 1. Ancient and Mythical. The Church of Rome, though admitting no woman to a share in performing its services, has yet made a woman the patron saint of music. The religions of antiquity have paid even more homage to the weaker sex in the matter, as the multitude of musical nymphs and fostering goddesses will show. Of Saint Cecilia herself little is known accurately. The very apocryphal legend states that about the year 230, a noble Roman lady of that name, who had been converted to Christianity, was forced into an unwilling marriage with a certain Valerian, a pagan. She succeeded in converting her husband and his brother, but all were martyred because of their faith. This, it is stated, took place under the prefect Almachus, but history gives no such name. It is unfortunate also that the earliest writer mentioning her, Fortunatus, Bishop of Poitiers, speaks of her having died in Sicily between the years 176 and 180. It is doubtful whether she would have been known at all in connection with the art, but for a passing phrase in her story, which relates that she often united instrumental music to that of her voice in sounding the praises of the Lord. Because of these few words, she is famed throughout musical Christendom. Half the musical societies in Europe are named after her, and Raphael's picture, Dryden's Ode, Stefano Moderno's statue, and 100 other great artworks have come into existence. The earliest inferences of woman's influence in music are to be drawn from the Hindu mythology. According to the tabular schedule of all knowledge found in the ancient Brahmin records, music as an art belongs in the second chief division of lesser sciences. But on its mathematical and philosophical side, it is accorded a much higher position, and is treated of in the oldest and most sacred Hindu work, the Veda. This authority tells us that when Brahma had lain in the original egg, some 1,000 billion years, he split it by the force of his thought, and made heaven and earth from the two fragments. After this, Manu brought into being 10 great forces, whence came all the gods and goddesses, good and evil spirits. Among the lesser deities were the genii of music, Gandharvas, and of those of the dance, Apsarasis, who furnished entertainment for the gods before the men possessed the art. About this time, the female element began to assert itself. At Brahma's command, his consort, Sarasvati, goddess of speech and oratory, brought music to man, incidentally giving the Hindus their finest musical instrument, the veena. The demigod Narad became the protector of the art, but Maheda Krishna performed a more material service by allowing 5 keys or modes to spring from his head in the shape of nymphs, while his wife Parbhuti produced 1 more. Then Brahma helped the cause along by adding 30 lesser keys or modes, all of them in the form of nymphs also. These modes varied in character, some of them being too fiery to be attempted by mortals. It is related that Akbar, the emperor, once ordered the famous singer unequal to sing the Ragni, or improvisation of the mode of fire. The poor singer entreated for a less dangerous task, but in vain. Then he plunged up to his neck in the waters of the river Junma and began. Before he had finished half of the song, the water around him began to boil. He paused, but finding the emperor's curiosity relentless, continued the strain, until at the close his body burst into flames and was consumed. Another melody caused the formation of clouds and the fall of rain, and a female singer is said once to have saved Bengal from drought and famine by means of this lay. Many other refrains had a similar power over the forces of nature, and one could make the sun disappear and bring on night at midday, while others could change winter to spring or rain to sunshine. In all Indian legends, the charm of music is described as of intense potency. All animate and inanimate nature is represented as listening with ecstasy to the singing of Krishna and Parvati. When Krishna was on earth in the form of a shepherd, there were 16,000 pastoral nymphs or shepherdesses who fell in love with him. They all tried to win his heart by the power of the music, and each one sang to him in a different manner. Hence arose the 16,000 different keys which were said to have existed at one time in India. The Hindu musical system of today is likewise ascribed largely to female sources. The scale consists of 7 chief tones, which are represented by as many heavenly sisters. The names of the tones, sa, re, ga, ma, pa, da, ni, corresponding to our do, re, mi, etc., are merely abbreviations of the names of the nymphs who preside over them. The tones of the scale are divided into quarters, and the number of quarters in the diatonic scale intervals is 3, 4, 2, 4, 4, 3, and 2. Thus, the number of possible modes is vastly greater than in our own scale, which has only semitones. There are 6 chief modes represented by 6 genii, while each one is married to 5 of the 30 nymphs who typify the lesser modes. Each one of the genii has 8 sons, and these are wedded to a nymph apiece, making 48 in all. Every member of this prolific musical family presides over something, if it is only one of the quarter tones that form the scale. To illustrate the method of naming, the 4 quarters of the 5th scale tone, Pa or Panchama, belong to the nymphs Malina, Chapala, Lola, and Sivaratna. The next full tone, Da, is owned by Santa and her sisters. If the higher tone Da should be flattened, giving it the same pitch as the upper quarter of the lower tone Pa, the Hindu musician would not speak of Da as being flat, but would say instead, Sivaratna has been introduced to the family of Santa and her sisters. The Hindu music of today is not as potent as in mythical times. The people themselves acknowledge the decline of their art, and admit that even in the last century or two it has deteriorated. As for the miracle-working ragas or improvised songs, the people in Bengal will say that they can probably be heard in Kashmir, while the inhabitants of Kashmir will send the inquirer back to Bengal. Woman too has a less important position than of old. When the ancient sages made our musical system, says an eminent Brahmin in an interview at San Francisco, there were many women among them, but now not one can accomplish anything in the art. In the traditions of ancient Egypt, music is entirely under the patronage of male gods. Thoth, the Egyptian Hermes, invented the lyre by striking the tendons of a dead tortoise, which had dried and stretched in the shell. Osiris too, the chief of the Egyptian gods, protected the art, although Strabo says music was not allowed in his temple at Abydos. While traveling in Ethiopia, the story runs, Osiris met a troop of reveling satyrs, and being fond of singing, he admitted them to his train of musicians. In their midst were 9 young maidens skilled in music and various sciences, evidently the prototype of the Grecian muses. Horus, the son of Osiris, equivalent to the Greek Apollo, was considered the god of harmony. An important mythical character was Maneros, son of the earliest Egyptian king. He seems to hold the same position as Linus, son of Apollo, among the Greeks. The first song of Egyptian music was a dirge for his untimely end, and a lament for the swift passing away of youth, spring, joy, and so on. Gradually, the song itself, instead of the king's sons, began to be called Manaros, and became a well-known banquet song of social feasts, calling upon the guests to enjoy life while they might. In time, the song became a symbol of gaiety and merriment instead of grief. In most of the ancient civilizations, the songs appear to have been accompanied by a clapping of hands to mark the rhythm. There were many actual dances, also in ancient Egypt, as is fully proven by a number of old paintings. Some were like our jigs, breakdowns, or clog dances, while others consisted of regular figures, such as forward and back, swing, and so on. The latter kind being restricted to the lower orders. In all of these, women must have taken a large part, and doubtless they were responsible for some of the music. They were not allowed to play the flute, but could indulge in the tabor and other instruments. Some of the scenes depicted closely resemble the modern stage, and it is more than probable that when the audiences of today applaud our own ballet scenes, they are enjoying themselves in the old Egyptian manner. There can be no doubt that women played an important part in music, possibly even in composition, in many civilizations, which apparently allowed her only a restricted field of action. The Empress of Germany recently defined woman's sphere as consisting of 4 subjects: children, clothes, cooking, and church. Yet the German women have far more influence than this official utterance could indicate. It is not surprising, then, to find in the folios of Lepsius a reproduction of something analogous to our conservatories of music. It represents a course of musical instruction in the school of singers and players of King Amenhotep IV of the 18th dynasty. There are several large and small rooms connected with each other and containing furniture and musical instruments. In some are the musicians practicing and teaching. One teacher sits listening to the singing of a young girl, while another pupil is playing the accompaniment on a harp. Still another girl stands attentively listening to the teacher's instructions, as in a modern class. In another place are 2 girls practicing a dance with harp music. In one room is a young lady having her hair dressed, while in another a young girl has placed aside her harp and is sitting down to lunch with a companion. All this goes to show that different civilizations often resemble one another more than they would appear at first sight, and very probably woman's part in ancient Egyptian music was much like that which she plays in her own today. The earliest Hebrew music was undoubtedly modeled after that of Egypt. In later biblical times, however, there were many national instruments, and the style of the music must have been characteristic. The Old Testament, even in its earlier books, contains many examples of the songs of the people. Their ancient folk music showed 3 principal styles: joyous bridal song, the cheerful harvest or vintage song, and the wailing funeral song, and there are many examples of each in the scriptures. As there was no definite notation among the ancient Hebrews, the actual tunes that were sung with these songs will never be known. But it may be possible that the melodies have been preserved by rote, for it is certain that these 3 schools of singing exist today in Arabia and Syria. Whole villages are known to unite in a 7-day festival of rejoicing, not unlike the ones at the wedding of Samson, as described in the 14th chapter of Judges. The Song of Solomon presents an entire set of bridal songs in the popular vein. A good example of the morning song is found in the opening chapter of the 2nd book of Samuel, where David laments the death of Saul and Jonathan. It is somewhat exceptional because of it being rendered by a man, for in Eastern countries the professional mourners were always women, hired for the occasion. The men might join in the chorus of woe if they wished, but the main part of the song was always given by the women, who were not unlike the keeners heard in Ireland on similar occasions, even down to recent times. The Book of Lamentations presents a series of funeral songs written in imitation of the professional lays of grief and containing many allusions to the mourning women. In the 5th chapter of Amos and Habakkuk, and many other books, are further illustrations of such folk songs. The 5th chapter of Isaiah begins with the cheerful style of the vintage song, and then suddenly changes to a song of grief, forming an artistic contrast that must have been highly effective. In the Hebrew songs, as in the Egyptian, there must have been much dramatic action united with the vocal work. When the word dancing occurs, it generally means only gesture and pantomime. Its use is made evident in the Song of Moses in Exodus 15. It requires little imagination to picture Miriam using a folk song with which her hearers were familiar, improvising words to suit the occasion, and illustrating the whole with successive gestures of pride, contempt, sarcasm, and triumph, while the assembled multitude joined in the chorus at every opportunity. Still more evident does this union of voice and action become in the Song of Deborah and Barak in Judges 5. A possible description of the performance of this musical comedy is given by Herder, who suggests that probably verses 1 to 11 were interrupted by the shouts of the populace. Verses 12 to 27 were a picture of the battle with the naming of the leaders with praise or blame, and mimicking each one as named. Verses 28 to 30 were mockery of the triumph of Sisera, and the last verse was given as a chorus by the whole people. According to this, the tune must certainly have been a familiar one. The whole scene, with its extemporized words as clapping of hands to mark the rhythm, and its alteration of solo and chorus, was probably not unlike the singing at some of the camp meetings on southern plantations. Foremost among the patrons of the art in Grecian mythology are the Muses. These were not always 9 in number. Originally at Mount Helicon and Boeotia, 3 were worshipped: Melite, meditation; Mneme, memory; and Aide, song. 3 Muses were also recognized at Delphi and Sicyon. 4 are mentioned as daughters of Jupiter and Plusia, while some accounts speak of 7 Muses, daughters of Pyrrhus. 8 was the number known in Athens until finally the Thracian worship of 9 spread across the whole of Greece. The parentage of these divinities is given with as many variations as their number. Most commonly they were considered daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, memory, born in Pieria at the foot of Mount Olympus. Some call them daughters of Uranus and Gaia, others of Pyrrhus and Antiope. Still others of Apollo or of Jupiter and Minerva. The analogy between the Muses and the 9 maidens in the Egyptian troupe of Osiris has already been noted. In Homer's poems, the Muses have already attained their well-known abode on Olympus, where they sing the festive songs at the banquets of the immortals. They were supposed to inspire the mind of the bards, and in early times the poets were perfectly sincere in invoking them and believing in their inspiration. The Muses, in presiding over the various branches of Grecian art, appeared unable to brook any rivalry. Thamyris, an ancient Thracian bard, boldly challenged them to a trial of skill, and on being overcome by them in contest, was deprived by them of his sight and of the powers of singing. He is represented in art as holding a broken lyre. The 9 daughters of King Pyrrhus of Macedonia fared no better, and after an unsuccessful contest were changed into birds. The Muses were closely connected with Apollo, who was well looked upon as their leader. Many mountains, as well as grottos, wells, and springs in various parts of Greece were sacred to them. The sirens were another personification of the marvelous power of music among primitive peoples. Their parentage also is variously given, though they are usually mentioned as daughters of the river god Achelous. They are generally represented as maidens with a more or less extensive equipment of wings and other plumage. These wings were obtained at their request when Proserpine was carried off, that they might be able to hunt for her. But another account says they refused their sympathy to Ceres and were given their feathery coating by her in punishment. Some writers say it was due to Aphrodite, who was angered at their virginity. The sirens, as well as other ambitious performers, were rash enough to attempt a contest with the Muses, and met with customary defeat. The victorious nine then pounced upon the unfortunate trio and tore off wings and feathers. The siren's chief occupation consisted in sitting on the rocks by the sea and singing to passing mariners. According to Homer, their island lay between Aya and the rock of Scylla, or near the southwestern coast of Italy. But the Roman poets placed them on the Campanian coast. Their magic power, to charm all hearers, was to last only until someone proved himself able to resist their spell. And here again accounts differ. Homer gives the credit to Ulysses, who stuffed his mariners' ears with wax and had them bind him to the mast. Apollonius Rhodius, however, in the Argonautica, claims the credit for Orpheus, who saved the expedition of the Argonauts by singing the sirens into silence, after which the musical damsels fell from their heights and were themselves changed into rocks. If some of our modern musicians were put to the same test and condemned to death if they failed to charm their auditors, the results would be beneficial both to art and to the cemeteries. The power of the sirens lasted until after their death, and like their cousins in Egyptian and Indian lore, they used their music to charm the souls of the blessed dead. Leaving the realms of the supernatural, the only great name that the student will find among the musical women of Greece is that of Sappho. The story of her life is known only in its general outlines, and even these have been subject to many learned disputes. She was born near the close of the 7th century BC, either at Mytilene or at Eresnos in the island of Lesbos. She grew to maturity at the former place, and became one of the great leaders of the Aeolian school of lyric poetry. From the fragments of her poetry and those of her great rival Alcaeus, it is evident that the two were not envious of each other's fame, but lived in the most friendly intercourse. Of the events of her life we have only two. One, referred to in the Parian Marble and by Ovid, is a flight from Mytilene to Sicily between 604 and 592, to escape from unknown danger. The other is the well-known story that, being in love with Phaon and finding her love unrequited, she cast herself from the Leucadian rock. This rock is a promontory on the island of Leucas, upon which is a temple to Apollo. At the annual festival of the god, it was custom to cast down a criminal from this rock into the sea. To break his fall, birds of all kinds are attached to him, and if he reached the sea uninjured, boats are ready to pick him up. This apparently was a rite of expiation, and as such gave rise to the well-known story that unfortunate lovers leapt from this rock to seek relief from their distress. The story of Sappho and Phaon is one of these, but it has been claimed that its authenticity vanishes at the first breath of criticism. It is fair to class Sappho as a musician, for in ancient Greece poetry and music were inseparable. Of her poems, which filled 9 books, only a few fragments remain, of which the most important is a splendid ode to Aphrodite. At Mytilene she appears to have gathered about her a large and elegant circle of young women, who were her pupils in poetry, music, and personal cultivation. Her influence must have been widespread, for the list of her disciples includes names from all parts of Greece. Her work of teaching in the midst of her fair followers has been compared to that of Socrates surrounded by the flower of the Athenian youth. The power of her poetry is shown by the story of its effect on the rugged character of Solon, the lawmaker. Hearing for the first time one of her pieces sung to him by his nephew, he expressed in the most impassionate terms the wish that he might not die before having learned such a beautiful song. The career of Sappho is made more wonderful by the fact that women's work in ancient Greece was supposed to consist only of family duties. She taught her sons in childhood until they were sent to their regular masters, and she guided her daughters and set them an example in doing household duties. According to Pericles, that woman was most to be prized of whom no one spoke, either in praise or blame. Because of Sappho's prominence in social activity, but more especially because of the ardent character of some of her poems, her good name has been assailed by many modern critics. The majority, however, consider the accusations as groundless. Alcman, the great lyric poet of Sparta, Lydian by birth, brought the so-called Lydian measure to its highest perfection. He was always ready to praise women in his verses and wrote some choruses especially for the honey-voiced, lovely singing maidens, which were sung by female voices only. Boeotia could boast of two great poetesses. Myrtis, a native of Anthedon, is reported to have been the instructress of Pindar, and is said to have contended with him for the palm of superiority. She was famous throughout the whole of Greece, and many places possessed statues in honor of her. The second poetess was Carina of Tanagra, sometimes called the Theban because of a long residence at Thebe. She flourished about 490 BC and was a contemporary of Pindar. Like Myrtis, she is said to have instructed him and is credited with having gained a victory over him in public games at Thebes. Only a few fragments of her work have been preserved to us, but Pausanias, who states that she defeated Pindar no less than 5 times, thinks that her personal charms may have had something to do with the matter. While teaching Pindar, Carina once offered to beautify his earlier efforts with mythological allusions. The pupil, nettled by his criticism, soon brought to his instructress a new poem, of which the first 6 stanzas touched upon every part of Theban mythology, whereupon she cooled his enthusiasm by remarking with a smile, "One must sow seed by the handful, not by the bagful." Whether the character of these earlier poetesses was above reproach or not, it is certain that in the later days of Grecian civilization, music was handed over to the most degraded classes. In Egypt, the caste of professional musicians was not held in any respect, and the art was often merely an added accompaniment to enhance the value of slaves. So too in Greece, the practice of music was given over to the heterae, or courtesans. That these women were at times able to win a high position is amply proven by the case of Aspasia. A native of Miletus, she came to live in Athens, and there gained the affections of the great leader Pericles, not more by her beauty than by her high mental accomplishments. The story of her life and that of the literary and philosophical circle which he drew around her is too well known to need repetition. Another famous courtesan, though less well endowed mentally and evidently on a much lower plane of character, was the famous flute player Lamia. It was her beauty rather than her intellect that won the great honors which she attained, and a temple dedicated to her as Venus Lamia, as well as a signet upon which a portrait has been preserved, bear witness to this fact. The character of Greek music can only be conjectured. At first simple, it was regulated on a mathematical basis by Pythagoras, who understood the laws of vibration. Later on, it developed into something more rich and varied, and while still devoted to unison or melodic effects, it was undoubtedly full of beauty, as is the old Scotch music. Its great development, as well as the use of many small instruments, guitar, flute, etc., go far to prove that music must have formed a larger part of women's domestic life than the actual records show. Roman civilization borrowed much from Greece, especially in the matter of art. It is not surprising, therefore, to find that the musical status of Rome, especially in her later days, was a mere replica of that of Greece. In the instrumental field, we find the lyre of less importance, but the flute, a term that included reed instruments also, was constantly used in ceremonial and sacrificial music. Trumpets were in use at all triumphal processions, while in the days of the empire, the well-known but problematical water organ became popular. Although the Roman domestic conditions admitted of more freedom than those of Greece, it is doubtful if the women took any important part in performance or composition of music. There are no great poetesses on the Roman roll of honor, while there are many on that of Greece. Rome differed from Greece in having its poetry and music written by different authors, while in Greece both words and notes emanated from the same brain. But even among men, the Romans possessed no important composers. The names of those who wrote music to the plays of Terence and Plautus, the plays themselves being imitations of the Greek, are known to history, but the composers possessed no possession of consequence. If the men received no great homage, there must have been little incentive for women to strive in the musical field. As in Greece, female slaves played a large part in the world of art, with this difference, that in Rome the masters were usually on a lower plane of cultivation than their own slaves. Dancing was an adjunct to music, though often praised as a separate branch of entertainment, and brought to a high state of perfection in its pantomimic form. The position of women in the Far East was inferior even to her station in Greece and Rome. China, for example, everything feminine was held in contempt. This had its influence on the musical system of the Chinese, according to one of their legends. After the invention of music, the formation of various instruments, and the composition of many songs, all due more or less to mythical emperors Huang Ti, who reigned about the year 2600 BC, decided to have the arts specifically investigated and its rules formulated. In his day, music was practiced, but not understood in its natural elements. The emperor therefore ordered Ling Lun to look into the matter. This dignitary, about whose work many anecdotes exist, traveled to northwestern China and took up his abode on a high mountain near a bamboo grove. On cutting a stalk and excavating the pith between two of the joints, he found that the tube gave the exact pitch of the normal human voice, and also the sound given by the waters of the Huanghe, which had its source near the scene. Thus was discovered the fundamental tone of the scale. Meanwhile, the Fanghong, or sacred bird of Chinese mythology, appeared with its mate and perched upon a neighboring tree. The male bird sang a scale of several tones, while the female sang another composed of different tones. The first note of the male bird coincided in pitch with Ling Lun's bamboo tube, and by cutting other tubes, the erudite investigator proceeded to reproduce all the tones of both. By combining these, he was able to form a complete chromatic scale. But owing to the prejudice against the weaker sex, the tones of the female, called feminine tones even today, were discarded in favor of those of the male bird. The latter, the basis of Chinese music, corresponded to the black keys of our piano, while the former were equivalent to the white or diatonic notes of our scale. That Chinese music, based on this pentatonic scale, need not be at all displeasing is proved by many of the old Scotch tunes, which are built on the same system. An excellent illustration of its rhythmic structure, frequent iterations, and melodic character may be found in our own familiar tune, "There is a happy land far, far away." The harsh quality that Europeans often find in Chinese performances is undoubtedly not a necessary adjunct, as the same criticism may be made upon many by our own street singers or brass bands. The Chinese, like many other ancient nations, have a great contempt for the caste of musicians and actors, though enjoying the drama keenly. Parents have almost unlimited power over their children, and may sell them as slaves or even in some cases kill them, but they are not allowed to sell them to the troops of strolling comedians or to magicians. Anyone convicted of doing this or aiding in the transaction is punished by 100 blows of the bamboo. Any person of free parentage marrying an actor or actress receives the same punishment. Yet while musicians connected with a stage are held under the ban, those who devote themselves to the religious rites receive the highest esteem. These, however, cannot be women. The music of Japan, though built on the chromatic scale, was much the same as that of China. Actors and musicians command hardly more respect in the island than on the continent. Women play a negative part in both countries, if we accept the geishas, who entertain in the tea houses. But Japan has made such rapid strides in civilization recently that it may not be impossible for women to develop the activity that she has shown in the Western lands. Chapter 2. Medieval. The position of woman among the northern races that overthrew the Roman power was wholly different from that which she held in the more ancient epoch. and even under the newer regime it was no enviable one. In many of the earlier Germanic systems, wives were bought by a definite payment of goods or of cattle. That this was a recognized practice is shown in the laws of Ethelbert, which state that if a man carry off a free man's wife, he must at his own expense procure another for the injured husband. Usually women had no rights of inheritance. In some cases they could inherit where there was no male children, and in others they could transmit the right of inheritance to their male descendants. Sometimes they were allowed to inherit movable property of a certain sort, probably largely the results of their own handiwork. The evident idea of the Salic law was to allow women a marriage portion only, and as soon as she was safely bestowed upon some neighborhood group of people, neither she nor her children had any further claim upon the parent group. Great cruelty was evident in the treatment of female slaves. According to the laws of Athelstan, if one of these were convicted of theft, she could in punishment be burned alive by 80 other such slaves. A similar example of stern discipline is afforded by the ecclesiastical provision, occurring no less than 3 times, that if a woman scourged a slave to death, she should do penance. It is little wonder that under these conditions the female slaves would sing in a rather forced manner, if at all, and the women themselves would hardly indulge in the gentle art of composing music. The early Christian church, too, afforded no encouragement for women to exert their musical abilities. When the earliest meetings occurred in the catacombs, the female members of the congregation took their part in singing the hymns, but when organized choirs were formed, they were allowed no place. The singing schools founded in Rome by the Popes Sylvester I and Hilary at the end of the 4th century were devoted solely to the training of male voices. In describing the earlier music, St. John Chrysostom says, "The psalms which we sing unite all the voices in one, and the canticles arise harmoniously in unison. Young and old, rich and poor, women, men, slaves and citizens, all of us have formed but one melody together." But the custom of permitting women to join with men in the singing was abolished by the Synod of Antioch in the year 379. In the music of the Celtic and Gaelic races, also, women had no place. Their songs, like their lives, were martial in character. The harpists of Ireland and Wales and the bagpipers of Scotland were all men, and they made strict rules about the admission of new members to their guilds. Even among the early English minstrels, who devoted their powers to the milder art of love songs and Christmas carols, no women are to be found. The wandering life of these bards and singers was too rude at first to admit of participation by the gentler sex, and was only under more stable conditions of civilization that woman at last gained the opportunity of showing and develop her talents. With the advent of chivalry, she found herself at once in a more exalted position. In this epoch, when cultivated minds began to devote their energies to other things besides fighting in war and carousing in peace, music found new and worthier subjects in nature and love and the beauty of woman. Under the new system, she became the arbiter of all knightly disputes, the queen to whom all obedience was due. From this extreme worship arose the schools of the minnesingers and the troubadours, who paid her manifold homage in the shape of poetry and song. According to the general statements of history, the minnesingers began their career in the time of Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. This would place their origin in the latter part of the 12th century, yet it is a strange fact that Heinrich of Veldig, usually accounted the pioneer in his new school of singing, utters a complaint about the loss of the good old times, and bewails the decay of the true greatness of the art to which he devoted himself. The original song in which he expresses his sentiment is still extant. That many of the early songs of the minnesingers have been preserved is due to the forethought of Rudiger of Manesse, a public officer of Zurich in the 14th century. He made a thorough collection of all specimens of the style of minnesingers, and many subsequent works, such as that of von der Hagen, are based upon his researches. The language ordinarily used by the Minnesingers was that of Swabia, which was that employed at the imperial and many lesser courts of Germany. They used it with a skill and delicacy which was generally far superior to the style of the troubadours. In performing their works, they do not, like their Western brethren, have recourse to hired accompanists or jongleurs, but supported the vocal part by playing on a small viol. The jongleurs were essentially a French institution, and no class of musicians similar to them existed in Germany. The Minnesingers, like the troubadours, were amateurs, and aimed to keep free from the taint of professionalism. Men of the highest rank were proud to belong to this order of musicians, and emperors and princes and famous knights are found among them. The love songs of the Minnesingers, as already intimated, were less fiery than those of the troubadours. While the Provençal minstrel allowed as homage to his chosen lady to proceed to extreme lengths, his German brother paid a little less excessive, but far purer tribute to the object of his affections. Very often, too, the German poets rose to a still higher level, and sang praises of the ideal qualities of womanhood in general. Thus the singers of Germany caused far less domestic discord than those of France. There was still some unlicensed gallantry, however, can be seen from the type of music known as Wachtlieder, or watch songs. In these, the amorous knight is represented as pleading with the watchman of the castle for admission to his lady-love. Sometimes the song took the form of a warning from the watchman telling that the daylight was near and the night must depart. Besides giving the world a host of shorter songs, the period of Minnesingers brought forth some really great poets who were successful in the larger forms. The author or authors of the famous Nibelungenlied are unknown, but the work remains to us as the greatest epic of Germany. Foremost in point of fame stands Wolfram von Echtenbach, author of the familiar Parsifal. In depicting his characters, he strikes a note of idealistic beauty. Another great poet was Gottfried of Strasbourg, almost as famous as Wolfram, and in some respects his opposite. His characters are endowed with life and vigor, and eager to seize the pleasures of earth while they last. His best work was Tristan and Isolde. The legend of Tannhauser, which has crystallized and been handed down to us in history, has an undoubted basis of fact. The existence of the cave of Venus in the Thuringen Hill of Horselberg may be taken as not proven, but there certainly was a tournament of song at the castle of Wartburg, and many famous knights probably took part in it. Whether Tannhauser himself was real is an open question, but there can be no doubt about Walter von Wogenweder, who was one of Germany's greatest masters of the shorter forms. And with that flurry of German names, I think I'm going to call it a night. If you've liked what you've heard here so far, and I think it is quite an interesting read from my perspective as a lapsed musician, even if very old-fashioned, you can find it on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepytime Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get new episodes whenever they come out. A reminder that the music for tonight is Un Désert by unequal. Check out more of their work on their website, which you'll find linked in the show notes. Good night, and sweet dreams.